Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Arohana Podcast by the Ananta Center. I'm your host, Richa, and today we're joined by Dr. Shayak Sen Gupta, India Program Lead at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us, Shayak. In this
Thank you.
episode, we will discuss the implications of President Trump's return to the White House on global climate policy, US domestic energy priorities, and what this means for India's clean energy ambitions and strategic climate partnerships. To begin with, I think let's start with what has already changed. Shayak, in your opinion, what are some of the most consequential climate and energy policies that the Trump administration has reversed after coming into power?
So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think there are several. One of which is the U.S. Withdrawing again from the Paris Agreement. Second, we're starting to see rollbacks of environmental regulation domestically within the United States. Those are still a work in progress, given that legally, anytime an agency needs to review or change regulations, they have to go through a very arduous, long process, put things up for public comment. I think the most consequential that we're starting to see over the last week has been funding freezes for both the Inflation Reduction Act as well as the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's known as the IIJA. But these were two bills that were introduced and signed by President Biden and with, by majorities in the U.S. Congress to increase clean energy investment and spending in infrastructure as well as several other areas during the previous presidency. And the Trump administration ostensibly to review some of this funding has frozen some of this. And it's, at least for the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of that isn't affected because it's tax credit. So when companies and individuals will file for taxes, they can avail those funds. But any direct loan or grants from the U.S. government have been paused. I think they're kind of the funding freeze is also affecting foreign assistance, and so we'll get to that when it affects India. But I think the uncertainty that this has caused, especially for things for funding that's tied to contracts that were signed already by the United States government, even if these actions will generally be overturned or not allowed, it's up for what either the U.S. Congress or the Supreme Court or the judiciary to kind of enforce those things. And so it will take a few more months for us to actually see what the impact of those are, but already it's kind of creating enough uncertainty, whether that be in the private sector or in state and local governments.
Thank you for that. You briefly mentioned the Paris Agreement, and my follow-up question would be that how do you think that Trump's arrival at the climate scene will slow down global investments? What shifts will it lead to in the pattern of global investments in clean energy, climate action, and on a broader level, not just investments, but trust in international climate commitments?
Yeah, one of the silver linings of, well, there are not many, but one of the silver linings of the United States, again, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement is the world has been here before, right? So, um, from 2017 to 2021, we kind of adjusted globally to the United States not being party to this agreement. And ultimately, the agreement was set up in such a way to be voluntary, to partly due to the vagaries of U.S. politics, because the U.S. Senate would have to ratify any kind of binding treaty. The way the agreement was structured was to kind of avoid that because the U.S. Senate was unlikely to pass anything like this. So, optimistically, you'll still continue to see coalitions of the willing. But I think we need to be a little bit more sober about the limitations of the Paris Agreement. It's very good to have this motivating force to increase ambition, especially this system of bottom-up, nationally determined contributions. I think are meant to very much suit domestic capabilities and concerns. But a key limitation is it's enforced by national governments, right? And so they will always put domestic interests and populations first. I think, one of the, at least in terms of one of the fears I have, and we'll see this pouring out, is some countries pulling out of the agreement, citing the U.S. as an example. So, I think it's too soon to say, but I will say that, we every year when COPs happen to rehash, parts of not parts of the agreement, but rather, updates on progress. We hear headlines that there's a lack of consensus. So I think countries need to have a faith that they can benefit from the process. So, I think you asked about investment patterns. I think it's, again, too soon to say, but ultimately domestic economic competitiveness and kind of business environments are really what determine investments, right? So the United States is still a very attractive market based on economic fundamentals. And, even though this Trump administration, especially the beginning of it, is producing some of this uncertainty, investors still may view the additional risk and still better than putting their money in other countries. So, I think clean energy investment, energy transition investment is going to happen. One president and one agreement is not going to kind of reverse the tide on that. And I think it's important to note that global climate finance or clean energy investment is still disproportionately concentrated in wealthy countries. So that has not changed regardless of whether we had a President Biden or President Obama or even a President Trump. And so, the U.S. frankly was not contributing its fair share to climate finance through its public budgets, and it's unlikely to. So I think, optimistically, the world has already kind of baked some of this in. Now, again, this is more of a hypothetical. We don't know. I think we'll have to see if whether some of the uh, reversals or kind of reprioritization in clean energy and climate policy that we're seeing domestically within the Trump administration, whether that extends to bilateral and multilateral agreements or ties that are a bit more binding, right? And that will constrain the policies and choices that other countries can make in their energy transitions. And again, this is a very hypothetical. We haven't seen that yet. So, I don't not confident that this would happen, but I would look out for that to see if it's actually influencing the policies. So in overall investment patterns, I don't expect to change. I think the trust deficit is always concerning, and I think broader kind of foreign policy from the United States will be a larger kind of judge of that rather than just the Paris process of it in and of itself.
Sure. Okay. So, from a more global perspective, I would like your insights on how this will shape domestic climate action, subnational climate action in the US,
Mhm.
particularly in states like New York and California.
Right, right. So I think it's no secret that the Trump administration is a fan of clean energy and climate policy. One of the really encouraging things about the United States, much like India, is states have a big role to play in kind of advancing policy, being more ambitious. So of course you're going to have places like California and New York kind of go full steam ahead. And I think we hear this often is there is a lot of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of that money is going to Republican controlled states who may not be ostensibly very climate forward or clean energy forward, but if it makes economic sense, they will kind of back those investments. So my home state of Texas is a very good example, right? Because it's so easy to build um, energy and power plants and infrastructure in general, you're seeing kind of solar take off in Texas much faster than you do in other parts of the country. Again, that's kind of the positive side of it. And I do think, a lot of Republicans, when push comes to shove, will support this given that it's producing benefits in their constituencies. Again, the more trade-off or potential limitation or negative side of this is, again, we're seeing over the last week or so, you know, everyone kind of understood that this administration was not a fan of clean energy or climate, and that's, it is what it is. But having them kind of put in pauses and freezes, which every administration does to some extent, but the kind of depth that we're seeing of some of this money of contracted money that the U.S. government has agreed to put out, Um, that will affect many states. It's not just the red states and the blue states and the Californias and the Texases, right? And that even if again in a few months we'll start that that money might come back and the flow of federal money will be going. Um, there is again that uncertainty, and that's not great for any kind of business decision or investment. So it's very much like even in theory, if a lot of these policies and strategies are agreed upon by both Democrats and Republicans, especially Republicans, it's actually operationalizing them and making sure that the gears of government are working to make sure that that money is being put out in a timely fashion. I think that is something that we do need to be have an eye on to see what impact it would have. We're starting to see again inklings of projects shrinking and jobs kind of decreasing. But again, most of that IRA money is through tax credits, so it's not going to be affected by these freezes, but it's still something to keep an eye out on.
Thank you for that. Speaking of uncertainty, how do you see the current momentum in the India-US clean energy partnership? Have we already seen any signs of slowdown?
I would say that India is faring well broadly in its bilateral relationship with the United States. Prime Minister Modi is set to visit Washington, D.C. and visit with President Trump next week. And we're starting to see again that's really due to India's proactive diplomacy. There's been a willingness on the Indian side to reduce some tariffs for American imports into the country, buying more cargoes of U.S. Oil and gas exports, taking back immigrants that are undocumented here. Um, I think when it comes to clean energy, we're going to kind of see a bit of a pendulum swing, and that's again expected that we saw over the last 10, 15 years between Democrat and Republican administrations. Um, that a kind of an all of above approach when it comes to energy relations. And that's something I think India is no stranger to. That's been India's kind of energy and to some extent climate policy, through multiple governments, that we need access to energy of all forms to grow and develop. And that's, it's not a controversial or very politically fraught kind of policy to have amongst kind of domestic audiences or stakeholders in India. I think having that all of the above approach means that there would be a better understanding of why India, uses certain sources of energy like coal, being a heavily import dependent country on oil. Those understandings, I think, are going to be a little bit more forward. And I mentioned that India will likely see again Trump being a kind of transactional president, where some kind of grand bargain or deal is something that I'm keeping my eye out for. Um, we could see again more Indian purchases of U.S. oil and gas, especially given that the previous administration, right before they left, put sanctions on Russian oil, much of which was going to India as well as China. Um, and so, and during the previous Trump administration, India kind of complied with U.S. sanctions for Iranian oil, right? So it's not out of the ordinary or unprecedented that you'll see some of those import choices being constrained by the Trump administration. However, I would say that a lot of this oil and gas trade is market driven, right? So short of drastic action by governments, a lot of this will be around the margins. Um, in terms of like specific areas, something I'd be really interested in, I think I'm optimistic about, is nuclear energy. Given that we had the annual budget in India being presented over the weekend, where nuclear took a very prominent role. We had about 20,000 crores, or about $2.3 billion um, for smaller nuclear reactors in India, as well as a commitment to reform the liability regime, as well as the Atomic Energy Act in India to open it up potentially to private sector participation. So we could see again the at least the foundations being laid for American companies to come and set up nuclear technologies in India, and that's been kind of missing piece, right? Because if you look at history of how U.S.-India relations have grown over the last 20 years, 20, 25 years actually, the nuclear deal from 2008 is very much kind of the crown jewel. It's what kind of ushered in a blossoming of ties. But the original intent of that agreement was American exports of nuclear equipment to India and civilian nuclear equipment for power generation. That hasn't happened due to some of the legal hurdles as well as the economics in India. Um, Another place I would be looking at is the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. So that's the development bank of the U.S. government. It was reorganized slash kind of recreated during the first Trump presidency. It directly lends money or offers financial products for private sector development. And India is one of the largest portfolios. It has about $60 billion of exposure. I believe about 10 billion of that is in India. So it enjoys bipartisan support. Again, because it's private sector led development, it in theory should get support by Republicans. And so I'd be interested to see kind of what are the investments that agency makes. They've done a lot of kind of clean energy manufacturing and climate investments during the previous Biden administration. But given the agency head hasn't been named yet, so and it's going to be up for reauthorization through Congress. So lots of different things that will come there. And then finally, I will say again, I hate to kind of go back to this spending freeze, but the kind of operationalizing a lot of this cooperation. If, again, for example, USAID is not able to function in its kind of normal way, it might come in a new form, but if it's going to be different. A lot of the technical assistance in clean energy or just energy in general between the United States and India is handled through that agency. So there are USAID foreign service officers who are diplomats stationed at the embassy in New Delhi who implement a lot of these things. And so, clean energy cooperation, again, cooperation kind of in the broad sense, I have confidence that will continue and leaders will agree where it makes sense for countries to agree and do kind of projects. But I think this large scale kind of skepticism of this administration to foreign funding, or rather foreign assistance or money out to foreign governments or foreign entities, I think does mean that we're going to see a little bit of a slowing down of those types of activities in India or with India.
That was extremely insightful. Shayak, just following up on that, when we're talking about particular sectors, what are your insights on the India-U.S. Critical Minerals Corporation? How will that be affected? That's one. And perhaps the second part would be, do you think that this sort of withdrawal by the U.S. creates a space for India to assume a greater leadership role in global climate action?
Yeah. I think the critical mineral space is very interesting. This administration is a lot, even though they're fairly skeptical of climate and clean energy, critical minerals is something that they understand that there's a strategic imperative to secure those supply chains. And the Mineral Security Partnership, which was this grouping of mostly OECD countries in the United States plus India, a quote unquote kind of a buyer's club. They've started, investing in projects or at least kind of facilitating some of these things. Again, it's too soon to say. There has been talk of some kind of critical minerals agreement between the United States and India. If you could see, whether, but the thinking on that, at least in the previous administration, was the agreement would happen so that um, kind of Indian exports and investments were eligible, or rather exports were eligible for Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. Now, we don't know how stringent of a interpretation the Trump administration will take, and again, it's going to take time. But some kind of agreement uh, might be part of it. But I would say it's going to be part of a larger. Um, I hate to use the word trade deal because we've been hearing about a U.S.-India trade deal for many years and it hasn't happened. But again, there's some momentum of given that the Trump administration is willing to kind of reevaluate kind of some fundamental U.S. kind of tenets when it comes to trade. You could see that, critical minerals cooperation or some reduction in tariffs or just kind of co-development potentially through, again, US DFC happening with India. But it's, again, a little bit too soon to tell until the administration gets its appointees in some of these agencies that are more kind of nitty-gritty, kind of project oriented. We'll see if that happens. And then your question on kind of India assuming a greater leadership role. Look, I think um, the in my mind, kind of the United States and India occupy two different kind of poles or positions of leadership when it comes to global climate. There are a lot of things that the countries agree on, can learn from each other, especially when it comes to, renewables and now we're seeing investments in clean energy manufacturing and so on. But ultimately, the US is an relatively energy abundant, developed economy with a very high per capita income. And, the choices that it makes that influences its climate stances are to some extent fundamentally different than what India as a lower middle income developing economy that's still, I would say, energy scarcity is still, energy access is still top of mind for not only consumers, but decision makers in the country. So I'm optimistic that there's going to be a lot more kind of private sector cooperation, right? Renewables and kind of the market in India is attractive enough. And there's a case to be made for getting more foreign investment. Um, and it's kind of up to governments to help facilitate those. So, the leadership position I think India will occupy is going to be it's already occupying a fairly unique position amongst countries both developed and developing, and I think that will continue under this president in the United States.
Thank you. We've tried to cover as much as possible in the little time that we had, and it was definitely very thought provoking. So, thank you very much, Shayak. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the Arohan podcast. Stay tuned for more in depth insights on critical global issues. Thank you.